Welcome to the sixth video here in our lecture series for AP Environmental Science. This one's going to be on biogeochemical cycles, and just to kind of break down this word, bio, of course, means life. Geo would be rocks and the earth, and chemical are chemicals. This is how chemicals and nutrients that we need move through the living portions of the world and through the non-living portions of the world. And so this is kind of the general cycle here. The big atoms that we need, the elements that we need to survive, and the building blocks of life are over here in this nice little acronym, SHNOPS. You've got carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. These six chemicals here, or six elements, are critical to supporting life on Earth. If you look at this picture, this is the famous picture known as the blue marble taken from the moon. What I like about this picture is that it shows there's nothing out here. And so there is a sun, and the sun gives off energy, which comes down, and we get this energy input from the sun, and it eventually is lost as heat. But there's that constant input of solar energy. The other part of this is the matter, right? The matter here on Earth must constantly be recycled. We have no new inputs or outputs of matter. So it is kind of a set amount, and it moves through the environment, through the living portions, the non-living portions, and has to be recycled as it does so. So we've got the law of conservation of matter. We can't create or destroy matter. And if you look at this orange here, right? Eventually this orange is going to break down and decompose, and so the atoms and molecules that it's made of, they're not going to be lost, they're going to be changing forms. And so it's probably got some pretty fancy carbohydrates in here. When it decomposes, those carbohydrates are going to be broken down into smaller molecules as the decomposers get energy from breaking those bonds, and some of them will be released in the atmosphere as gases. Some of them might dissolve into water and run down into an aquifer. Some of them may stay in the soil, other bacteria may get their hands on them. So all the atoms and molecules that make this up are going to be kind of recycled, changed into something else. Kind of why are they important? So carbon, this is known as the building block of life. It has 4 valence electrons. These 4 valence electrons are really important because it's able to form a lot of bonds, and so it's very flexible in what it can bond to. So it's found in lipids, it's found in carbohydrates, and DNA, proteins. Pretty much any organic molecule is going to have some form of carbon in it. So this is a very important one. Hydrogen is also important. Of course, you've got water molecules having hydrogen in them. And then beyond that, this is a brief shot of the light cycle of photosynthesis. Hydrogen is really important here as it moves through ATP synthase. It allows that extra phosphate group to be attached to ATP, giving us our energy molecule. So it's really used to create energy through ATP synthase. The next part of SHNOPS is nitrogen, and so nitrogen is used for amino acids. This would be an amino acid here. On the right side here, we've got our carboxyl group, and any amino acid is going to have one of those. There's going to be a central hydrogen, or central carbon, excuse me, with a hydrogen attached to it. And then you have this nitrogen-containing unit on the end, the amino group. The R is what's going to differentiate amino acids, and I put guanine up here. This is one of the 4 amino acids found in DNA, along with cytosine, thionine, and adenine. The next one here is oxygen. So again, we've got oxygen in our water molecules. And then oxygen is also really important here in cellular respiration. This is where the oxygen plays a role right in the end here. It really wants those electrons back that get taken from it in the very beginning. And when we give them back to it, it allows us to get a lot of energy out of cellular respiration. Phosphorus is the next one, the P. Phosphorus is really critical in DNA. So, right, we've got our phosphorus in the backbone. It's a sugar phosphorus backbone. And that phosphorus is in the form of phosphate, but it's used in each one of these background pieces. It's also critical in ATP, right? Triphosphate. There are 3 phosphate groups attached to an ATP molecule. ATP is where we get all our cellular energy from. They're also found in the phospholipids, So these kind of make our cell walls and keep things we don't want in our cells out of our cells. The last part here is sulfur. Sulfur is a lot less used by organic life, but it does play an important role. These are two different amino acids, and so amino acids make up proteins which have these really unique 3D shapes, and the shape really determines what their purpose is, or what they're going to do for a cell or for an organism. And so sulfur is important for making these disulfur bridges between two amino acids, and so they're really important for keeping the shape of some of these proteins the way they should be. So biogeochemical cycles, there's going to be a couple different things to look out for. You want to look for where they are stored. So a reservoir or a sink is kind of where it's stored for an extended period of time. Each one of the cycles is going to have a superior reservoir or sink, somewhere where it's going to spend the majority of its time. Then there will be an exchange pool. This will kind of be where we get it in a form we can use. So something like nitrogen is all around us in the form of N2 gas. N2 gas is not biologically available, so that would be one of our reservoirs and sinks. It needs to be converted into something that can be used by us, a form like nitrate or nitrite, and then that can enter the biological community. So in the biological community, usually you're going to see it enter in the plants, and then the animals get it by eating the plants. The plants kind of have it all figured out how to turn these things into usable forms. First one is the hydrologic cycle. This is probably something you're familiar with from previous years. Biggest storage spots for hydrologic cycle would be atmosphere as gas, or in surface water such as ocean or lakes or rivers. It moves through the atmosphere in a couple different ways. Precipitation is going to be how it exits, and once it precipitates, it has a couple different options. We're pretty familiar with absorption. This is where the plant roots would absorb the water, or people or animals would drink the water or eat plants that have water in them. The plants can give off water in two ways. One of them is through transpiration, which is where the water in their leaves actually evaporates through the stoma and leaves through the stoma, which pulls new water up through the plant. They also go through cellular respiration, just like animals do and humans do, and those types of organisms. That respiration also gives off water to the environment. When it rains on land, it kind of has two options from that point. If it's not being absorbed by plants, it can run off and enter a river, which could flow to a stream, to a lake, to an ocean, and sit as surface water. Or it could go underground through infiltration or percolation. If you've heard of percolation before, you may think of coffee, where you run water through the coffee rinds and it absorbs the compounds that make up coffee. Same type of deal, right? We're running water through the soil that's pretty porous, and it enters the aquifer, and it can stay there for a long time and flow to surface waters, or it could be pumped up by us if we're have a pump on that aquifer, we're extracting it. Once it's on the surface water, it can evaporate, and with transpiration and respiration, that's how it returns back to the atmosphere. A couple of things about human impact on the water cycle. Big one is irrigation. So with irrigation, we are speeding up the depletion of aquifers, right? We are physically drilling holes down into them and pumping the water that has been stored there, sometimes for a long, long time, back out to the surface. And once it gets to the surface, it's kind of re-entered the water cycle. It's not locked away underground. It's free to evaporate, or in this case here, the farmer is really hoping that it gets absorbed by plants. But through both of those mechanisms, we're increasing its evaporation or transpiration back into the atmosphere, this water that used to be locked up down below. Dams play another big role. So a dam is going to create a large, slow-moving body of water, which is very susceptible to evaporation again. So it's going to increase evaporation, and it will also slow down water getting downstream. The Colorado River is a big example of the downstream waters being severely affected by large dams upstream that severely limit the flow down, and we lose a lot of water to evaporation. And so some of these streams even end up being close to drying up on the other end. Wetland destruction, this is typically going to be for development or building new lands. The city of Jacksonville is built majority of downtown is over a former wetland. And so wetlands are really important in slowing down the flow of precipitation and kind of allowing that water to stay in the soil and potentially enter the groundwater or the aquifers. And so destroying a wetland is going to kind of short circuit that cycle, and it's going to make it skip the aquifer step, where now, like the city of Jacksonville is all pavement and concrete. So when it rains, that water doesn't have a chance to penetrate or percolate or infiltrate through that ground layer because it's solid rock. It runs off now into the river and is pushed out to the ocean, and we don't get that recharge into the aquifer. Another big one is climate change, right? As the atmosphere heats up, we end up melting some of that frozen stock of fresh water that we have stored on the poles. That is a big sink that's being reduced through warmer climates. Carbon cycle is another important one, right? Carbon's the building block of life. Biggest storage spot or the largest reservoir for carbon is in the atmosphere. It is a huge sink for carbon. The ocean also stores an awful lot of carbon in it as well. And so really the only way for carbon to leave the atmosphere is through photosynthesis. In photosynthesis, right, the plants take in carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide is then fixed and turned into carbohydrates. From those carbohydrates, a couple of things can occur. The plants themselves are going to use some of those carbohydrates up to grow and be healthy, and that is through cellular respiration. Some of those carbohydrates will be consumed by animals, and the animals again will go through cellular respiration and breathe it back out as CO2. Also, some of those plants or some of those animals will die or give off waste, right? Waste products contain carbon in them, but so do the physical bodies of the plants or the organisms that die. When that happens, a couple things could happen. It can decompose, and that would just be bacteria decomposing it. It could be burnt, right? If you have a lot of dead wood, it could catch fire and burn, or it could be compacted and become fossil fuels over millions of years. And so eventually, it's going to be put back up into the atmosphere. This side right here is a really large human generated side of the carbon cycle that is taking what is essentially a storage point for millions of years and releasing them in a very short span, right? We've only been burning fossil fuels for a little over 150 years. And this cycle here has taken millions of years to store them away. So we are really increasing the amount of atmospheric CO2 because we're releasing all this kind of stored stuff. How does humans impact the carbon cycle? Biggest one is fossil fuel use, right? We're using up that storage at a much faster rate than it's being made. So we have a net increase in atmospheric CO2. Another big one is burning and clearing a forest. This is a big common practice in the developing world for creating new agricultural lands, is rather than go through and take down all the trees, you would just burn the entire area, and in doing so you release all the carbon stored in their bodies. Also, anything that we incinerate, waste incineration has been picking up some steam in certain countries. Waste incineration is going to release carbon. Anytime you burn something, you're breaking bonds and forming carbon dioxide. So that is going to be the first half of this lecture video. We will cover the nitrogen cycle in the next ones in the second half. Please come to class tomorrow with some notes and ready to discuss this. Look forward to seeing you then.